Hi, my name is Mike Wimmer. You're visiting my studio today. I'd like to talk about my newest book, George. George is the second in the series of my Mount Rushmore series. Theodore was the first one. I think I chose Theodore primarily because he was just my favorite president. I loved his energy. I loved the kind of aspect of his childhood, coming away, being a sickly child and remaking himself as a self-made man, his adventurous in the West. George, of course, being the founding father, I loved because of the research I got to do. I got to go to Mount Vernon and got to stay on the grounds of Mount Vernon for almost a week, and they gave me complete access to everything I needed to know. I could walk through the grounds, I could take pictures of his teeth if I wanted to take pictures of his teeth. I saw his clothes, I saw the instruments inside his house, the things he used as a soldier, the things he used as a civilian. And the grounds themselves have been kept in perfect condition of the period. So you can go and see what it was like to live as George Washington and Martha Washington at the time. Some of the other projects I've got in the studio today are a portrait that I've just finished for the University of Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. It's going to hang in one of their reading libraries. And then I'm working on a couple of small gifts that are going to be given away as thank yous, and they're little heads. Just something fun to kind of, I guess, give away to the people that have helped out on a couple of books for the state capitol. And if you like it, the kids are always curious about my paints and how I paint my palette. I've got my little, what I call my commando box. I can take this out on location to paint with, and I use it pretty much the same way I used my full palette, and it gives me a full color range. For those little artists who are curious about it, if you want to kind of zoom in, I can give you a little bit of their colors. I always start with, of course, have to have white, and then the next one would be a nice cadmium yellow medium, an earth yellow, which is yellow ochre, then raw sienna, then raw umber, it's kind of a dark dirty brown, a cadmium orange, a terra rosa. My favorite color really out of my whole palette is transparent oxide red, cadmium red, a alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and then viridian. And of those colors, I can create anything I want. You can see the palette leans pretty heavy to the warm colors because I'm painting mostly skin. And because I'm doing that, I really need to keep the palette fairly warm for the skin tones. And of course, as you see from this portrait, it was a very warm portrait. And so I had this in my commando box so that when she came, I could just kind of quickly do the sketches and the studies on her face to make sure all the colors were correct. Yeah, I'm standing next to some paintings that are really done for fun. I mean, with all the work I do for everybody else, I still find time to paint for myself. And in my travels, when I'm going around looking at different things, you never know where you might find a beautiful picture. I was visiting Sturbridge Village and found this potter, and took a number of photographs that day and did quite a few sketches of him. Because he was just so intense in his work, he didn't pay me any attention whatsoever. I got 3 or 4 of the paintings out of this little photographic session. I really liked his workshop. I loved the mud everywhere. I loved his pottery at the top, and created a nice, what I think is a very homespun painting. This other one next to it was done as a demonstration for a portrait workshop I did with all the Moore public high school teachers. And the guy I used as my model was a friend of mine from my MFA project. His name's BJ, and BJ actually wears that monocle. He's such a character, I had to paint him. So I've done a couple of sketches of BJ, and I like to use him as a model for some other projects too, but he is a real character. And then when I was doing my research for George, I went to Fort Loudon, Tennessee, and because their reenactors are experts and they know everything about the French and Indian War, and so they reenact the French and Indian War. And so that was the only place that I could find that particular part of my George Washington research. It's long before the Revolutionary part of the war, so that's why these are actually American uniforms. This is American militia under the British, of course that's why it's red, under the British command instead of the blue ones that we're used to. But this was a painting I did while I was painting as a demonstration in Ithaca. I was the featured artist in Ithaca at their Festival of Arts, and had a lot of people come up and ask questions. I was just there for everyone to come around and watch. So it's a little bit like, you know, being in a fishbowl when everyone comes to watch you paint and looks over your shoulder and asks, what gob of color is that? You know, so it's kind of funny, but the kids are always curious. They get as close as they can too. Some of the other things are just projects I'm working on. You can see some of the heads that I've used as models for some of my either sculpture projects or some of my painting projects. The studio itself, if you see the brushes, my kids are fascinated. All the kids who come in the studio are fascinated by all the stuff. You know, they love the fact that I have all these brushes. They've all been used, they continually to be used. My collection of paints, you know, when I pull out and show, I've got every color under the rainbow that you can imagine. These are just my whites and my grays. And then I've got my yellows and my oranges. And then I've got my reds and my pinks. And then I've got my earth tones, my browns, my deep earth reds. And then I have my blues and my purples. And then I have my greens. So every color under the rainbow is set aside, ready for me to paint, right at my hand, my fingertips whenever I need it. Because you never know, especially when you're in the middle of something, either you need more paint or you need a very particular color. Well, this is kind of the heart or the workstation of the studio. We all have to be adults. We have to be adults at least one day a month when we pay bills. This is where we pay bills. This is where the invoices are sent out to my clients. This is where the contracts are signed. This is where the letters are answered. This is where, I guess, you know, all the business part of being the illustrator, being the artist has to be taken care of. And you can see the artist part encroaches very much on the business part too. Look at this large frame. It's standing here waiting to be put on that large painting you just saw of the lady whose portrait's going to be in Oklahoma State University. Behind it you can see some of the paintings of my kids, of course, my favorite models. And other projects. Here's one that just recently was finished for the Washington Post. It was a full-page ad on the back page of the Washington Post. And it was really for the Washington Post, trying to teach, I guess, get the word out for everybody else to enjoy reading the Sunday Times in the old format of a paper. We see everybody enjoying their news or getting their news on their new modern electronic devices. But everyone still seems to be fascinated with this old technology. So I guess he's just lost in his own little paper and his own little world, enjoying himself with his coffee and his muffin. We'll talk a little bit later, and I'll end with the new book, George. I'm hoping you guys have enjoyed my studio visit. I know the kids are always curious about it. And I'll let David pan and see the view I have of the studio too. Before we end, I wanted to share a little of my new book, George, with you. From this page here, I guess we start, and I really enjoyed the way Governor Keating started the book out. I am remembered as the father of my country, the indispensable man, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of my countrymen. And we see what most of us remember George Washington as, the father of our country, the commander-in-chief who led our army into victory over the British, and also later became the first president. But you got to remember, George started out as a little boy. First, I was a child. I was born February 22nd, 1732, the fifth of 10 children. My Virginia birthplace was a house built on a bed of oyster shells. My parents were Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. To my great sadness, my father died when I was 11. And then throughout the rest of the book, it shares different aspects of young George's life. That way he was kind of homeschooled. He went to some school. He finished his education by the time he was 11 and was working on his brother's farm at that time after his father died. And later, I alluded to the fact that he had chopped down the cherry tree. That's a myth, really. So here we see him chopping wood, getting ready, for the fireplace. He actually worked as a young laborer on his brother's farm. And because he was the fifth of 11 children, he really wasn't going to inherit the farm or the family's wealth. And so had to find very early his way in the world. And his first job was that as a surveyor, surveying many of the wild lands of the West. And throughout the rest of the book, we learn how he became the commander-in-chief, how he led the battles in war, how he became the first president, how he brought us to victory over the British. And then at the very end, his own thoughts The sad thing about George Washington's life, he loved Mount Vernon so much, and he wanted to be there in Mount Vernon. Throughout the whole presidency, throughout the whole time he was fighting the war, and then he was recruited to be the President of the United States, and after serving as President for 8 years, he was finally able to come back to Mount Vernon, where he was only able to live for 2 years before he passed away. Here we see him looking out over the Potomac River from the back porch of Mount Vernon. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the visit to my studio. I hope you have lots of questions and ask your teachers, and also feel free to look on our website, look on the OCAI website, look on my website, and if you have more questions, read the book. All the answers are there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.